We're beginning part 2, 1961, of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. Chapter 10, An Assassination Capability. On the morning of February 24th, 1961, in residential Miramar district of Havana, Che Guevara left his home on 18th Street and walked with his bodyguards down the pretty, tree-lined street, headed to his car. As he climbed in the driver's seat, 4 or 5 assassins emerged from where they'd been hiding in the bushes and opened fire. A violent gun battle left one of Che's neighbors, a man identified as Mr. Salinas, dead in his car. As Che sped away, his bodyguards continued firing. Inside the house, Che's wife, Adelia, heard the intense gunfire. She grabbed their 3-month-old daughter, Adelia, and with their nanny, rushed to hide under the stairwell. In Havana, there was a great news blackout on the attempted assassination. Adelia Guevara kept the story secret for 30 years, sharing it with Che's biographer, John Lee Anderson. After she left Cuba for Spain to live in exile, because Cuba is a police state, very little unflattering news ever leaves the island. That such an important leader such as Che Guevara would be vulnerable to assassination was not a message the Castro regime wanted to convey. Instead, a semi-official cover story emerged, purporting that the dead man, Mr. Salinas, had been having an affair and that the killing was an illicit romance gone awry. In a country where possession of an illegal firearm was a capital offense, the cover story seemed implausible. Was the CIA involved? Or were the assassins really anti-Castro Cubans, acting on their own? Further news was repressed. Not surprising given Che Guevara's views of the press. Newspapers are instruments of the oligarchy, he told the Cuban people. We must eliminate all newspapers. We cannot make a revolution with free press. As of 2019, the mystery remains unsolved. But in response to the assassination attempt against him, Che Guevara is said to have kept a grenade in the cigar box he often carried. After 3 failed attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, in late January or early February of 1961, Felix Rodriguez was reassigned to the CIA's Brigade 2506. He was placed on a 5-man direct action paramilitary team called a Gray Team. The Gray Team would be infiltrated into Cuba in advance of an assault by Brigade 2506 at Bahia de Cochinos. Bahia de Cochinos. The Bay of Pigs. Assassins' plans aside, the CIA was now moving forward with a covert action, amphibious invasion, followed by a coup d'etat. The CIA was relying on its Gray Team to locate, train, and equip pockets of previously identified resistance fighters, similar to what the OSS Jedburghs had done shortly after Allied forces stormed the beaches at Normandy. But in France, 93 Jedburgh teams had been airdropped in behind enemy lines. In Cuba, there were just 7 teams, each made up of 5 men. It was high risk, Rodriguez remembers. 35 of us went to Cuba. Only 15 survived. On February 28, 1961, Rodriguez and the members of his gray team left an isolated beach in Key West bound for Cuba. This time, instead of a yacht, they rode in a 25-foot Zodiac boat filled to the gunwales with weapons and explosives. 4.5 hours later, the team made a stealth beach landing at Arcos de Canasi, 40 miles east of Havana. It was Rodriguez's first time back to Cuba since he was a schoolboy. We had our weapons in backpacks, but we also had to land 2 tons of equipment, explosives, grenades, machine guns, ammunitions, and communications equipment. To be caught likely meant summary execution. Rodriguez and his gray team members were met on the beach by anti-Castro partisans, local farmers and sugar mill workers who were members of a group called Movimiento de Recuperación Revolucionaria, MRR, a pro-U.S. resistance movement. The MRR had already been partially armed. CIA air branch pilots had managed to covertly airdrop bundles of World War II-era M3 submachine guns and 45 pistols. In addition to the CIA's ground branch, there is air branch. What? In addition to the CIA's ground branch, there is air branch, which is the aviation wing of the Special Activities Division, and Maritime branch for amphibious operations. There is also a political action arm which interfaces with all 3 branches. From the beachhead at Arcos de Canasi, Felix Rodriguez was driven to Camagüey, where he met with the head of the Cuban resistance, a young man who went by the codename Francisco. Seeing him there on the street, you'd mistaken him for a student, recalls Rodriguez. Francisco was an eloquent, soft-spoken engineering student. He naturally inspired people, Rodriguez said. The popularity of Franco's movement made him the #1 target of Castro's intelligence services, and meeting with him was a tense affair. Over the next few weeks, Felix Rodriguez moved from safe house to safe house around Havana, meeting individually with leaders of the underground. In mid-March, he was called back to Miami to resupply. There he was told that he'd be reinserted again soon. The invasion would be happening any day now. Finally, word came. I was driven to the Keys by a lanky Texan who went by codename Sherman, Rodriguez calls. He presented me with something special to take to Cuba, a mini flamethrower. It fit very comfortably in one hand, yet it threw a 15-foot wide column of white phosphorus flame. The Texan told Rodriguez that the weapon was highly classified, but he wanted me to have it anyway. The time he was inserted near Moron on the Central Coast, there he was met by another member of the underground and driven to Havana in an old Buick. The flamethrower, hidden underneath the dashboard, Rodriguez was dropped off at a safe house in El Vedado and told to lay low and await orders. In its Bay of Pigs invasion planning, the CIA pulled yet again from its own history, as we have seen. Modeling the invasion and coup on the Guatemalan operation was ironic, given that those operations had radicalized Che Guevara. But Cuba in 1961 was a very different environment in which to operate than Guatemala had been in 1954. President Arbenez commanded an army of 10,000 men. Fidel Castro allegedly had 1,000,000 soldiers on call. Arbenez, a socialist, did not run Guatemala as a military dictatorship. Castro controlled the people of Cuba with absolute power, using Soviet tactics of repression and fear. Most significant of all, Arbenez did not have a direct line to the Kremlin the way Castro did. In hindsight, the CIA's disastrous covert action Bay of Pigs operation was born of wishful thinking. As with all military dictatorships, spies in Cuba were ubiquitous. For the CIA, the threat of a double agent was a constant source of concern. Unknown to the agency, Castro had managed to infiltrate its ranks long before the invasion was given the green light. In Miami, the CIA had recruited Benigno Perez Vivancos, a former lieutenant in Castro's army. Thinking he was an anti-Castro emigre, Vivancos stood out as a brave and reliable, and became the 78th fighting age male recruited for Brigade 2506. In fact, he was a Castro loyalist, sent by Havana to spy. The actions of this double agent proved deadly. On the night of April 1st, 1961, not long after Felix Rodriguez arrived in Havana with his mini flamethrower, Castro's G2 intelligence conducted a raid on a house outside Havana and captured Francisco, whose real name was Rogelio Gonzalez Corso. Tried and found guilty, he was immediately executed. Based on information provided by Vivancos, Castro's government rounded up thousands of people it identified as possible members of the resistance. Castro herded them into theaters, stadiums, and military bases to squelch the possibility of a spontaneous uprising to overthrow his regime, says a CIA Inspector General report. Unaware of the compromise, Rodriguez waited for word of the invasion. On April 13th, at CIA headquarters, Brigade 2506 was given the green light to set sail from Guatemala. On the morning of April 15th, 8 B-26 bombers, supplied by the CIA and flown by Cuban emigre pilots, attacked military airfields in Cuba in the first move of the covert operation. In response, Castro played an ingenious and unforeseen political card. He ordered his foreign minister, Raul Roa, to call the United Nations Political and Security Committee in New York City and demand that an emergency session be held. The request was honored. The session, attended by U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Aladi Stevenson, Cuba's foreign minister rightly decried the United States for having attacked a sovereign nation unprovoked. This was bad news for President Kennedy, whose number one priority was hiding the hand of the U.S. government, lamented an anonymous CIA staff historian in an agency report. kept classified for decades. Lying to the UN had serious consequences, and a second airstrike would put the United States in an awkward position internationally. The result meant disaster for Brigade 2506. President Kennedy, political considerations, trumped the military importance of a D-Day airstrike. Without a second strike, the amphibious assault had no chance for success, and the element of surprise was no longer there. Shortly before dawn the following morning, with Brigade 2506 just hours away from landing at the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy canceled the second round of airstrikes. Pilots who'd been sitting on the runway awaiting orders for takeoff were told to stand down. As the sun rose on the morning of April 17th, 1,311 members of Brigade 2506 made an amphibious landing, but instead of accomplishing a stealth infiltration, the CIA's paramilitary army of Cuban exiles were met on shore by Castro's military, whose forces far outnumbered and outgunned them. In Havana, Felix Rodriguez learned about the Bay of Pigs invasion while listening to the radio. All the Cuban radio stations were broadcasting the same emergency network, he remembers saying. The same thing. That the Americans had tried to launch a coup d'etat and had failed. Peering out the window, Rodriguez watched in horror as a sea of military vehicles moved through the streets, each one overflowing with Castro's soldiers. On Cuban state TV, news footage showed members of Brigade 2506 as they were captured on the beach and marched off into the woods, their fates unknown. 4 members of Felix Rodriguez's gray team were picked up and arrested. Rodriguez fled the safe house and made a run for the Venezuelan embassy. He was aware of a treaty that allowed political refugees safe passage out of Cuba. After weeks of hiding inside the embassy, he was finally loaded onto a bus of refugees and driven to the airport. In a bitter twist of fate, the bus drove first through Miramar, passing Che Guevara's home on 17th Street, where, 2 months earlier, the assassination attempt against him had failed. It continued on past Uncle Toto's once grand home on 5th Avenue and 28th Street, where Felix enjoyed so many happy childhood memories. It had been turned over to the state, says Rodriguez. Like all private property, it would be divided up among the people. Later, I would learn 5 Soviet families were living there, he recalls. The Bay of Pigs was an extraordinary political embarrassment for President Kennedy. In the Dominican Republic, Consul General Henry Dearborn, the U.S. State Department's charge d'affaires at the embassy in Santo Domingo, was woken in the middle of the night and told to cancel the CIA's plan to assassinate Trujillo. I recall a frantic message from the State Department. I guess signed off on by President Kennedy, Dearborn remembered, in 1991. It was saying, in effect, look, we have all this trouble with Castro. We don't want any more trouble in the Caribbean. Tell the people to knock it off, meaning the assassination plot. Dearborn followed orders, he says. I communicated to the opposition people that Washington was very much against any attempt at assassination. The answer I got back from them was, just tell Washington it is none of their business. This is our business. We have planned it, and we are going to do it, and there is nothing you can do about it. I relayed this to Washington, said Dearborn. The plan to assassinate Trujillo went ahead despite Washington's 11th hour attempt to call it off. On the night of May 30th, 1961, Trujillo was seated in a back seat of his chauffeur-driven 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, traveling down a country road outside the Capitol, when he was ambushed by a group of 7 assassins brandishing weapons provided to the rebel group by the CIA. We started shooting, recalled one of the officers, General Antonio Imbert, in an interview with the BBC in 2011. President Trujillo and his chauffeur were both armed, and they began shooting back. Trujillo managed to get out of the car. Trujillo was wounded, but he was still walking. So I shot him again and killed him, said General Imbert. We put him in our car and took him away. The assassins drove the dictator's dead body to a safe house belonging to the partisans, where it was later discovered by state police. Dearborn remembered hearing the news. He was out in the suburbs at a country club. The Chinese ambassador was giving some kind of money-raising thing for charity, to which I went. After the event ended, Dearborn and a colleague left together in a State Department car. We started back at around 11 p.m. and ran into a roadblock along the Ocean Highway. The state police were stopping cars and conducting searches. They looked in trunks, pulled up rugs, etc. I had a CIA fellow in the car. Along about January, the CIA had sent a couple of people into the consulate, and I said, Bob, this is it. I'm sure this is it. The state police wouldn't let the men continue down the road. When we finally got to the embassy, where I had been living for about a year, the telephone rang, and one of my main contacts of the opposition said, "It's over. He is dead." I knew immediately what happened and what went down to the office and sent off a message to Washington. For the CIA, the assassination of President Trujillo had been an inadvertent success. The killers got away, although they were soon to be betrayed by co-conspirator General Jose Roman. Hundreds of people suspected of being complicit in Trujillo's assassination were rounded up, detained, and tortured, in a move that echoed what happened in Czechoslovakia after Reinhard Heydrich's assassination by the British Special Operations Executive. 6 of the 7 Trujillo assassins were caught and executed. Only General Antonio Imbert got away. Decades later, the consensus in the Dominican Republic is that killing Trujillo was a heroic act, a textbook example of tyrannicide. What? The justified killing of a tyrant. A textbook example of tyrannicide. The justified killing of a tyrant. It's a new one to me. We Dominicans react very negative negatively when the people who killed Trujillo are called assassins, said Bernardo Vega, a former ambassador to the United States. Killing the cruelest dictator in the Americas, says Vega, was a good thing to do. The week after General Trujillo was buried, the U.S. State Department's Henry Dearborn was notified of a plan for his assassination. Dearborn was ordered to pack up his things, drive to the airport, and leave at once. He hurried to his office and located all the secret files into a burn barrel to destroy. Now, in good conscience, he said, he could leave. In a State Department oral history, he relayed a funny incident that drew to a close his 3 years as America's top diplomat in the Dominican Republic. I had my shirt, tie, shoes, and socks on, but couldn't find my pants, he remembered. I said to my administrative assistant, an officer's wife, "Where are my pants?" she said. "Oh my God, I packed them." She had to go back down to the car outside and unpack my pants so that I could leave the country with dignity. Upon landing in the United States, Dearborn was called to Washington, D.C. to participate in a briefing of the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy himself, intensely interested in covert action. He asked to be briefed on the Trujillo assassination by those involved. In declassified Senate testimony, Dearborn later recalled, "One enlightening part of the discussion occurred when I interrupted Kennedy and said, 'I think that the president interrupted me and said, "We already know what you think." In his oral history, Dearborn made clear what President Kennedy's statement meant to him. That showed clearly enough that he had been reading my cables, Dearborn said. Dearborn's remembrance is notable, given an official Department of Justice summation with respect to Trujillo's assassination. In giving testimony for the Attorney General's official report, that would be Attorney General Robert Kennedy, chairman of the special group, the CIA officials who were interviewed stated that they had no active part, but had a faint connection with the group, that did in fact assassinate the president. Henry Dearborn knew otherwise. When the meeting with the president broke up, he shook hands with me and said, "You did a good job down there." Dearborn stood by his actions and those taken by the president's special group advisors, the State Department, and the CIA. It is my firmly held view that those who killed Trujillo and those who backed them up would have acted if there had never been a CIA. They were only waiting for a favorable domestic and international atmosphere to give them the required courage, Dearborn stated on record in 1991. He died in 2013 at the age of 100. Wow. Shortly after Rafael Trujillo was assassinated, President Kennedy's special group formalized assassination as a foreign policy tool, a program it called Executive Action Capability, but what Congress later determined was an assassination capability. Declassified testimony to Senate investigators by CIA Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell suggests that the person who authorized the assassination capability was President Kennedy. The special group Augmented had received its orders from National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and Deputy National Security Advisor Walt Rostow. Bissell told state investigators behind closed doors, but these presidential advisors would not have given such encouragement unless they were confident that it would meet with the president's approval. Moving forward under the Kennedy administration, assassination operations acquired new euphemisms, including direct positive action, neutralization operations, an accident plot, and the last resort. Under the impossibly unsubtle cryptonym ZR/Rifle, the CIA's executive action was staffed with an array of people, from senior managers to case officers, even a principal agent with the primary task of spotting agent candidates, operatives willing to carry out and to conceal the executive action capability. The CIA's Technical Service Division provided covert action operators with whatever items they might need, from disguises to weapons to poisons. The Directorate of Support handled financial and administrative matters. The Office of Security made sure overseas clandestine facilities remained secure. Assassination was now an acceptable course of action, Congress learned, made possible through the establishment of plausible deniability. The chairman of the special group was usually responsible for determining which projects required presidential consideration and for keeping him abreast of developments. According to Bissell, after President Kennedy appointed his brother as chairman of the special group, Augmented, the construction became almost impenetrable. In this way, a system of plausible denial was fortified, said Bissell. A series of obfuscations that served as circuit breakers for presidents, preventing the Oval Office from being dragged into the scandal should a hidden hand operation be revealed. The president's assassination capability was intended to serve as a means of bringing order to an increasingly volatile situation unfolding in Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. Instead, it created mayhem, chaos, and collapse. But the real question, the riddle wrapped inside a mystery, inside an enigma, was and remains. By allowing the use of assassination as a hidden hand foreign policy tool, did President Kennedy become an easier target to assassinate? Did he do it to himself? Interesting thought. Until next time.